Tommy Cameron's Grace.
Chad Huntley. David Bridges. John Chen. Tom Brokaw.
The GOP is doing major damage control tonight as the federal investigation into the Capitol Hill page scandal intensifies. Can Speaker Hastert survive? Are Iraqi police the enemy within? Hundreds are pulled off the streets tonight accused of joining death squads as bomb attacks hit an all-time high and more Americans are killed. The amazing grace of the Amish community, where all those little girls were shot at school. And our series, The Homefront. Tonight, the friends and neighbors who make sure Americans in uniform get a real welcome home.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. The fallout from this scandal in Washington seems now to be spreading by the day and in waves like a stone thrown into a pond. Only in this case, each new wave seems to expose a cesspool hidden away on Capitol Hill. This scandal has already claimed one member of Congress, and today it claimed another congressman's chief of staff, while we're just beginning to learn the impact on some of the young students who go to Washington to serve as congressional pages. Tonight, the question continues to be, can the Speaker of the House avoid further damage or even resignation? We begin here on this busy news day with NBC's Chip Reed on Capitol Hill for us again. Chip, good evening.
Well, good evening, Brian. Today, law enforcement officials want to know if Mark Foley committed a crime. Here on Capitol Hill, the question is whether anybody did anything to stop him.
In Washington today, the Justice Department asked Congress to protect former Congressman Mark Foley's computers to preserve any potential evidence. This as a senior House staffer at the center of the scandal, Kirk Fordham, resigned. Fordham was once Foley.
Florida officials are trying to determine whether he can be charged under state law. Brian?
Chip Reed on the Hill again tonight for us. Chip, thanks. And beyond politics, one of the big questions for Republicans with just 34 days until the election is whether the Foley scandal specifically will keep social conservatives from showing up at the polls. Many were already disillusioned with the way things have been going, and it may again come down to turnout this November. That story from our chief White House correspondent, David Gregory.
In Kirkwood, Missouri, a Republican stronghold in a state with a close Senate race, some of the party faithful, like Pat Haley, are fed up with GOP leaders. Foley, he says, was the last straw.
I mean, there's too many things that have one right up and another in the last month. And I mean, who even wants to listen to the news at night?
Republicans now fear that frustration may keep social conservative, so-called values voters, home on a... The reality for Republicans is that the Foley story is a momentum changer, leaving the party to anxiously wonder just how long it will last. David Gregory, NBC News, the White House.
Now we switch to Iraq, and we have grim news from there to report tonight. 21 American soldiers have been killed in just the first 4 days of October. The U.S. military said today bomb attacks in Baghdad have hit a new all-time high. 4 Americans were killed just today in an attack on their patrol northwest of Baghdad. Despite the danger, hundreds of Iraqi police have been taken off the streets of Baghdad tonight, accused of possible complicity with death squads. We're joined tonight for all of this by NBC News Middle East Bureau Chief Richard Engel, who was with the U.S. Army at a base south of Baghdad. Richard, first, this stretch of violence, why now?
Good evening, Brian. U.S. military commanders tell us this has been a particularly deadly period for American troops because there has been an overall rise in the number of attacks, heavier fighting in Ramadi, sniper attacks here in Baghdad, bombings in the capital at their all-time high, including one today that targeted Iraq's interior minister. He survived, but at least a dozen other Iraqis were killed, Brian.
We report that they've taken police off the streets. What's behind that?
At least off the streets today will be prosecuted. U.S. military said today that others will be given, quote, national unity training. Brian?
Richard, thanks for that reporting. Our own Richard Engel embedded tonight with U.S. military forces. Late word tonight of a strong new reaction from the U.S. government to North Korea's announcement yesterday that it's going to test a nuclear device. We get the latest on this story from our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell in Washington. Andrea, what's this about?
Well, Brian, tonight the administration's top diplomat for North Korea, Christopher Hill, warned that the U.S. will not accept letting North Korea test a weapon, which would officially make Pyongyang a nuclear power. It's been suspected for decades, for more than a decade, but that would make it official. A test would be, according to Hill, something that's simply not acceptable. I said, well, what would you do to stop it? He wouldn't say what the threat could be, but Secretary of State Rice has been proposing incentives to get North Korea back to six-party talks. There are some hawks in the administration, Brian, who want a naval blockade similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right now, they're in a minority, but there's quite a debate on this going on inside the administration.
All right, we'll watch this situation. Andrea Mitchell in Washington tonight for us. Now to Wall Street. One day after reaching a new all-time high, the Dow Jones took off again today. A speech from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, was very well received, and the Dow finished the day up more than 123 points to a new closing high of 11,850 and change. That's another record. The Nasdaq was also up sharply, more than 47 points just today. When NBC Nightly News continues after a break here this Wednesday night, NBC News In Depth will have the latest on the school shooting in Pennsylvania and how the deep religious beliefs of the quiet Amish community are now being put to hard use. And later, they are your fellow Americans, and they have vowed that no one in uniform should come home from Iraq without a warm welcome.
They set themselves apart from nearly all modern conveniences, even electricity. They refuse government assistance and don't serve in the military. Forgiveness is a core belief. The grandfather of two sisters killed by the gunman spoke to NBC's Lancaster affiliate, WGAL.
Their anger towards the gunman's family?
No.
Have you already forgiven?
In my heart, yes.
How is that possible?
Through God's help.
It will provide an example to talk to their children about why violence is bad and why violence is sinful.
In the case of Marion Fisher's embalming, small children were brought in to watch.
The grandfather made the point that the children must not think of the man who did this as evil.
Along with forgiveness, there is a strong sentiment that this school should be torn down. But even with that, the Amish know they may never forget what happened here. Which is why Katie Weaver from an Amish community in Michigan came here to offer sympathy.
We can tell people about Christ and actually show you in our walk that we forgive. Not just say it, but in our walk of life.
Invited into an Amish home, I asked the community what they wanted from the world outside, and I was told, tell the world we are grateful for its prayers, but also remember to pray for the gunman's family. Brian.
Ann Curry in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, again for us tonight. Ann, thank you for that. We'll take another break here when Nightly News continues in just a moment. The harrowing tale of a mid-air collision that ended with more than 150 people dead from a passenger who lived to tell about it. This past weekend, you may have heard the story about the commercial flight in South America that crashed, killing all 155 people on board a Boeing 737. You may also have heard it was the result of a mid-air collision with another smaller commuter-sized jet, which survived the encounter along with all on board. It turns out it was a demonstration flight of the new, smaller jet for mostly media people. Tonight, a Brazilian newspaper reports the American pilots of that second jet may have disobeyed orders from the control tower just before the collision. Among the passengers on that demonstration flight, a New York Times writer named Joe Sharkey, who writes about air travel. He told us his story today in his own words.
Over the Amazon rainforest, and all of a sudden, bang, I hear. Not boom, not a roar, just bang. And I looked out at the wing, and my heart just dropped, because at the end of the winglet had been shorn off, and all that was left was the jagged base And I thought, well, I'll write a note to my wife and you know, say farewell and I love you, and put it in my wallet, figuring that, well, maybe they'll find that. There's a device that shows if there's a nearby airport that flashed an obscure code. And it turned out to be a once secret and now obscure air base. And we came in hot, and that's, you know, that's boom. These guys were bringing this thing in like a race car. I just saw them. I mean, it was an act of physical struggle to get this aircraft under control. We got out of the plane, looked back in shock to see that there was damage to the tail. One of our passengers came in, a guy who spoke Portuguese and had been to the commander's office, and I could tell by the look on his face that this was going to be bad news. And he said a Brazilian airliner with 155 people went down right where we had the impact. I said, you know, we need to have a moment of silence. You could just see that they felt the weight of this.
Joe Sharkey, who covers air travel for the New York Times. Readers of the New York Times have been trained to associate one name with the coverage of big, momentous events over the past several decades. If it was a big story or a developing trend, it was a sure bet that before long, on page one, you'd see a story by R.W. Apple Jr., special to the New York Times, it said. If you were lucky when you got older, you learned the insider's story that his friends called him Johnny. Johnny Apple was the son of a grocer from Ohio who fell in love with the New York Times at his local library. He got his start as a writer on this broadcast here at NBC News back in 1961. At the New York Times, he covered 10 presidential elections, 20 political conventions, and was the paper's bureau chief in 6 different nations. He covered the Vietnam War. He discovered Jimmy Carter before most did, and along the way, he set foot in 100 countries. He was an expert on food and wine and consumed as much of both as he possibly could. He died of cancer last night at the age of 71. Johnny Apple was indeed special to the New York Times and to all those of us who admired him so. We're back with more right after this. All week here we're doing a series of reports called the Homefront, and tonight's report defines that description. You're about to meet some of our fellow citizens who happen to have a big airport where they live. There always seems to be someone in uniform coming through on their way to or from Iraq or Afghanistan. These folks have now made it their business to love every one of them. Their story tonight from NBC's Janet Shamlian in Dallas.
A shower of affection. Weeks. Janet Shamlian, NBC News.
Hear, hear. That's our broadcast for this Wednesday evening. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams. We'll look for you again tomorrow evening. Good night.